This German Shepherd had never known kindness. He never felt a gentle touch. For years, this poor dog lived in pure fear, trapped in a world of cruelty. When rescuers finally found him, he was curled up in a dark corner, trembling so violently that his entire body shook. No one could get close. No one could touch him. Every attempt to help was met with terror. He would cower, growl, and even shut his eyes, as if hoping the world would disappear. Then, a woman named Clara did something no one expected. What she did shocked everyone and changed this dog's life forever. Before we continue, please like the video and subscribe to our channel to help raise awareness for animals' causes. Clara Bennett pulled into the parking lot of Bright Horizons Rescue Center, stepping out of her car into the crisp morning air. The shelter director, a man who had seen hundreds of tragic cases, looked worried. "We got a tough one this morning," he muttered, rubbing the back of his neck. Clara frowned. "How bad?" Daniel hesitated, then motioned for her to follow. "Come see for yourself." She walked past the rows of kennels, the familiar sounds of barking and whining filling the air. But when they reached the end of the corridor, there was only silence. She stopped in front of a small, isolated enclosure. And there he was. A large, underweight German Shepherd curled up in the farthest corner of the kennel. His entire body shook uncontrollably. His fur was patchy, his ribs showing beneath his skin. His ears were flattened against his skull, his head tucked so low against the ground that he looked like he was trying to make himself invisible. Clara felt her chest tighten. "He hasn't moved since he got here," Daniel said quietly. "Won't eat, won't drink, won't let anyone near him." Clara crouched down, pressing her hands gently against the chain-link fence. "What's his story?" Daniel sighed. "He came from one of the worst neglect cases we've seen. Backyard breeder. Never let out of a filthy, cramped cage. Never socialized. Never touched by human hands in a way that wasn't painful." Clara swallowed hard. She could see it. The way Max trembled, the way he refused to make eye contact, the way he flinched at the slightest noise. This wasn't just fear. This was a dog who had only known suffering. She took a slow breath. "Has anyone tried to touch him?" Daniel nodded. "Yeah, he exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "He panics, starts panting, shaking worse, like he's shutting down. Honestly, I don't know if he'll ever come around." Clara didn't respond right away. Instead, she did something unexpected. She slowly sat down on the floor, not in front of the kennel door, not reaching toward him, just sitting there. Daniel frowned. "What are you doing?" Clara's eyes never left Max. "I'm waiting," Daniel scoffed. "Waiting for what?" Clara's voice was steady. "For him to realize I'm not going to hurt him." Daniel sighed. "You'll be sitting there all day." She nodded. "Then I'll sit here all day." Max didn't move, didn't look at her, didn't react at all, but Clara stayed. Minutes passed, then an hour, then 2. Still, Max remained curled in his corner, his body tense, his entire world reduced to fear. But Clara? She wasn't going anywhere, because she knew the first step to healing was trust. And she was willing to wait. Clara sat on the cold shelter floor, her legs folded beneath her, her hands resting lightly on her knees. Hours had passed since she first positioned herself in front of Max's kennel, and yet she had barely moved. The rescue center had gone through its usual daily rhythm. Volunteers came and went, dogs were walked, and potential adopters passed through. But none of that mattered to Clara. Her focus was locked on the trembling German Shepherd, huddled in the farthest corner of his kennel. Max still hadn't moved. He was curled in on himself, his ribs visible beneath his thin coat, his head lowered so much that his nose nearly touched the concrete. His body trembled like a leaf caught in the wind, an endless quake of fear that refused to stop. But there was one difference. Clara noticed it immediately. His ears weren't pressed completely flat anymore. They were still low, still wary, but there was a flicker of something else, awareness. He knew she was there. Daniel Harris passed by, stopping momentarily to glance at her with an exasperated sigh. "You're still here?" Clara didn't turn to look at him. "I told you, I'll sit here as long as it takes." Daniel shook his head. "This dog is a lost cause, Clara. I've seen it before. He's completely shut down. He's not going to snap out of it just because you're sitting there." Clara didn't argue. She didn't need to. Because at that exact moment, Max's ears twitched again. It was barely noticeable, but Clara saw it. She knew what it meant. Daniel sighed, rubbing his forehead. You're stubborn, you know that. Clara allowed herself a small smile, but she never took her eyes off Max. I've been called worse, Daniel chuckled dryly. All right, well, don't forget to eat. If you pass out in front of his kennel, I'm not dragging you out. She nodded absently, her entire being focused on the fragile, terrified soul in front of her. More time passed. She was patient. She had to be. Every so often, other dogs barked, the sound echoing through the shelter halls. Each time, Max's flinching worsened, his tremors intensified. He squeezed his eyes shut as if trying to disappear. And yet, he never moved away from her. That alone was progress. Clara could work with that. After what felt like an eternity, the room quieted again, save for the occasional distant clatter of metal bowls or the faint sound of wind outside. She exhaled slowly and carefully, and then she made her first move. Gently, without speaking, she reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small, cooked piece of chicken. The smell filled the air. Max's nose twitched. Clara placed the food a couple of feet away from him. Not too close, not too far. Just enough that if he truly wanted it, he would have to move toward her. And then she waited. Minutes passed. Max did not move. She kept her breathing slow, her posture relaxed. She wasn't going to force him. She wasn't going to make the first approach. This had to be his decision. Another 5 minutes, then 10. Then, the first miracle happened. It was almost imperceptible at first. A slight shift of his front paw, a twitch of his nose. His body still trembled, but he was sniffing the air. Clara held her breath. Then, so cautiously that it seemed as though the world itself had slowed down, Max inched forward. It was small, so small. A single paw moved, dragging just an inch closer. Clara's chest tightened with emotion, but she didn't react. She couldn't. Any movement, any sound, and he might retreat back into himself. Another inch. Max's eyes flickered up just for a second. Their gazes met for the first time, and in that single fleeting moment, Clara saw something buried beneath the fear. A question. A silent, uncertain whisper in his broken soul. Can I trust you? She didn't answer, not with words. Instead, she simply stayed still, present, and finally, Max took another trembling step forward. His nose dipped lower, closer to the small piece of chicken on the ground. Another hesitation, another pause. Then he snatched it and bolted back to his corner. Clara felt tears sting her eyes, her hands curling into fists against her lap. It wasn't much. It wasn't complete trust. But today, for the first time in his life, Max had willingly come closer to a human. And that was everything. The next morning, Clara arrived at the shelter before anyone else. The sun had barely begun to rise, casting a dim golden hue through the frosted windows. The hallways were quiet, except for the occasional rustling of dogs stirring in their kennels. She took a deep breath before making her way down the corridor. Today was different. Today she wasn't just hoping for progress, she was expecting it. Yesterday, Max had made a choice. He had moved toward her. However small the step may have been, that meant something. As she approached his kennel, she felt her pulse quicken. Would he still be curled in the corner, trembling like before? Or had something changed? She reached the enclosure and froze. Max was watching her. Not curled into himself. Not trembling as violently. Just watching. Clara's heart tightened with emotion. Slowly, she sank onto the floor, mimicking her exact position from yesterday. Max didn't flinch. That alone was progress. The way he didn't retreat. The way his ears twitched in her direction. It was the start of something. Clara exhaled, steadying her emotions before carefully reaching into her coat pocket. She pulled out another small piece of chicken and placed it between them. Yesterday, it had taken him almost an hour to move toward her. Today, he hesitated for only a minute. His nose twitched. His ribs, still painfully visible, rose and fell with quickened breaths. And then he inched forward. One paw, then another. His entire body was still tense, still unsure, but he wasn't frozen anymore. He was moving. Clara didn't breathe, didn't blink. Max lowered his head. For a moment, it seemed like he might bolt again. But then he took the food. Not in a panic, not in fear, but with hesitation and thought. Clara swallowed hard, keeping herself as still as possible. Then, slowly, she turned her palm upward, an invitation. Max froze. The piece of chicken still between his teeth. His eyes flickered between Clara's outstretched hand and the floor. For a long time, nothing happened. Then, the miracle she had been waiting for. Max moved toward her hand. Not much, just a fraction of an inch. but enough that his whiskers brushed against her fingers. Clara's breath hitched. She didn't pull away, didn't move. And then, just as quickly as he had come close, he pulled back, retreating a step. Clara didn't let disappointment creep in, because today, Max had made the choice to approach her. And that meant everything. She smiled softly, keeping her voice low. "You're so brave, buddy." Max's ears twitched at the sound, and then, for the first time, his tail gave the tiniest wag. It was barely noticeable, a small, almost uncertain movement, but Clara saw it. And for the first time since meeting Max, she let herself hope. This was only the beginning. The next morning, Clara arrived at the shelter with a renewed sense of determination. Max had taken a step forward, a real, deliberate step. And last night, when she replayed the moment in her mind, she kept thinking about that tiny flicker of movement. His tail had wagged. It wasn't much, barely noticeable. But it meant everything. As she approached his kennel, she immediately noticed another change. Max was already watching her. Not curled in the corner, not trembling as violently. His ears weren't pinned back to his skull anymore. They were alert, listening. Clara felt her heart swell. She sank onto the floor in her usual spot, crossing her legs. And Max? He didn't flinch. That in itself was progress. She reached into her pocket, pulled out another small piece of chicken, and carefully placed it between them. This time, Max hesitated for only a few seconds. Then, slowly, cautiously, he stepped forward. One step, then another. Clara kept still, her body relaxed, her breathing calm. Max's nose twitched as he sniffed at the food. But this time, instead of grabbing it and retreating, he looked at her hand. It was a silent question, a test of trust. Clara swallowed hard. Slowly, carefully, she turned her palm upward, an invitation. Max froze. Clara could almost see the battle raging inside his mind, fear versus curiosity. For a long moment, he did nothing. Then he made his decision. Max leaned forward. His whiskers brushed against her fingers. Clara held her breath. Then, the miracle she had been waiting for. Max pressed his nose into her palm. Not by accident, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. Clara felt tears sting her eyes. She kept still, letting him take the lead. And then, another step. Max lowered his head slightly, his muzzle touching her skin. Clara's heart pounded. Slowly, gently, she moved her fingers, brushing them against his fur. Max flinched just for a second, but he didn't pull away. Her fingertips skimmed over his snout, barely touching, but enough for him to feel that this was different. This wasn't pain. This wasn't cruelty. This was kindness. For the first time in his life, Max had let a human touch him. And Clara knew there was no turning back now. The next morning, Clara arrived at the shelter before sunrise. The air was crisp and the world outside was still covered in a thin layer of frost. The shelter was quiet, with only the faint rustling of dogs shifting in their kennels as they stirred awake. But Clara wasn't thinking about the other dogs. Her mind was fixed on Max. Yesterday, he had let her touch him for the first time. He had chosen to trust a human, even if just for a moment. Would today bring another step forward? Or would fear pull him back again? She walked through the hallways, her pulse quickening as she neared his enclosure. Then, she saw him, and her breath hitched. Max wasn't pressed into the farthest corner. He was waiting. His body was still tense, still thin and fragile, but he was sitting up now. His ears half raised, his dark eyes fixed on her. He had been expecting her. Clara swallowed the lump in her throat. Slowly, she sank onto the floor, just as she had done every day before. And Max? He didn't flinch. That in itself was a victory. She reached into her coat pocket, pulling out another small piece of chicken. But this time, instead of placing it between them, she held it in her open palm, a test. Would he take it? Max's nose twitched. His body was still tense, his ribs, though still visible, moved with steady breaths. He stared at the food, then at Clara's hand. Another battle played out in his mind, fear versus trust. For a long moment, he didn't move. Then, ever so slowly, Max inched forward. One paw, then another. Clara held perfectly still. Max lowered his head. His nose brushed against her fingers. Then he took the food, not in a panic, not in fear, but calmly. Clara felt tears burn behind her eyes, but she blinked them back. This was real progress. Max was choosing to trust her, but just as she was about to speak, a loud bang echoed through the shelter. A door slamming, a voice shouting. Max's entire body jerked. His ears pinned back, his tail tucked. His breathing turned rapid and shallow. Clara watched in horror as the progress she had made crumbled before her eyes. Max bolted back into his corner, his body shrinking into itself, shaking violently. His eyes darted around the room, filled with sheer terror. Clara's chest tightened painfully. She knew this reaction. It wasn't just fear. It was a memory. Something about that noise, that sudden, sharp sound, reminded him of something from his past. Something bad. Clara took a slow, careful breath. She couldn't let panic take over. She had to be calm. "It's okay, Max," she whispered, her voice as steady as she could make it. Max didn't move, didn't breathe, didn't blink. Clara sat back. She had a choice. She could leave, give him space, let him calm down on his own, or she could stay, show him that this time he wasn't alone. So she stayed. Minutes passed, then an hour. She never moved closer, never spoke again, just stayed. And after what felt like forever, Max lifted his head. His eyes flickered to her, still filled with uncertainty. But there was something else there, something different. He had felt fear, but this time he had seen something else too. Clara hadn't left, and maybe, just maybe, she never would. The next morning, Clara arrived at the shelter with a mix of hope and worry swirling inside her chest. Yesterday had a breakthrough. Max had taken food directly from her hand, but then, in an instant, fear had stolen it all away. A loud noise, a bad memory, a moment of sheer terror. And just like that, he had shut down again. Clara knew that trauma wasn't something that disappeared overnight. She also knew one thing for certain: she wouldn't give up on him. As she approached his kennel, she braced herself for what she might see. Would Max be curled back in his corner, trembling like before? Or would he remember that she had stayed? She stepped into view and her breath caught in her throat. Max was sitting up. His body was still tense, but he wasn't pressed into the farthest corner. He was watching her, waiting. Her throat tightened with emotion. Slowly, she lowered herself onto the floor, and for the first time, Max didn't flinch. That was the sign she'd been hoping for. She reached into her pocket, pulling out a small piece of chicken. She hesitated for a second. Should she try to feed him by hand again? Would he trust her enough after yesterday's setback? She decided to test it. Carefully, she extended her palm, holding the food out for him. Max's ears twitched. His ribs still showed beneath his thin fur, his body still recovering from years of neglect. He hesitated, and then he took a step forward. Clara felt her pulse quicken. Another step. His breathing was slow but controlled. No panic, no trembling. And then before she could process it, his nose brushed against her fingers, and he took the food. Not in fear, not in desperation, but in trust. Clara blinked rapidly, forcing back the emotions swelling in her chest. She barely had time to react before Max did something that shattered every wall she thought he had. He lowered his head and gently pressed it against her open palm. A choice, a decision, a trust that wasn't forced, wasn't demanded, but freely given. Clara let out a slow, shaky breath. "You're amazing, buddy," she whispered. Max's tail flicked slightly, and for the first time, he didn't pull away. The past still haunted him, but today he had taken his biggest step forward, and Clara knew he was ready for something more. The morning air was crisp as Clara pulled into the shelter parking lot. Today felt different. For weeks, she had come to Max's kennel, sitting on the cold concrete floor, waiting for him to trust her. And yesterday, he had chosen her. Not just by taking food from her hand, not just by stepping forward, but by pressing his head into her palm. It had been the first time Max had actively sought comfort from a human. It was a moment Clara would never forget. But now, it was time to see if he was ready for the next step. She made her way through the shelter halls, pausing at his kennel, and what she saw nearly brought her to tears. Max was standing, not in fear, not in hesitation, but waiting. His eyes met hers. There was no flinching, no retreating to the corner, just recognition. Clara felt her throat tighten, but she didn't let the emotion overwhelm her. Instead, she did something she had never done before. She opened the kennel door, slowly, carefully. Max tensed but didn't run. He watched. His ears perked up slightly. Clara kneeled, extending her hand again. "Hey, buddy," she whispered. Max's body stayed rigid, but he didn't back away. Clara took a deep breath. Then, for the first time, she patted her leg. An invitation. A test. Would he step out? For a long moment, Max didn't move. Clara didn't push him. She waited. Then, Max did something that shocked everyone in the shelter. He stepped forward. past the invisible boundary that had trapped him in fear for so long, past the space where he had spent days trembling in terror. He stepped toward Clara. Then he stopped. His nose twitched, and he pressed his head into her chest. Clara let out a shaky breath, wrapping her arms around him as he melted into her embrace. For the first time in his life, Max had found safety. He had found love, and this time he knew it was real, because this time he had chosen it. If this story touched you in any way, please help us by subscribing to the channel to raise awareness about animals.